and tomorrow, but unfortunately I can't travel at the moment, so we'll have to let the miracles of technology do the work. So today I'd like to talk about the poetics and politics of coexistence in the work of Elia Ben-Amozeg. In his introduction to Israel et Humanité, Israel and Humanity, that was published in 1885 and that would serve as a jumping off point for his 1914 posthumous masterwork, Elia Ben-Amozeg identified the pressing issues of his time, namely the clash between religious and science, fragmentation within each religion, and conflict between them, all of which, he said, led to increased dogmatism, a rejection of modernity, and thus
זה הניסים של הטכנולוגיה. כן.
קודם זה הבא.
Quote, once religion proper is dismissed for good and cannot be long until metaphysics, too is sandpacking, he wrote in Israel and Humanity. So the stakes were even higher than the demise of religion itself. Quote, a further deplorable consequence could be the subversion of law, justice, moral, beauty, virtue, freedom, heroism, and sacrifice, which are nothing but applied metaphysics. And it is hard to see how such ideas can be preserved when their unique source shall have been stopped up. A secular world for Ben-Amozeg is thus a world that dismisses transcendence, and one of the places of moral and beauty for him is the arts, and especially poetry. So what Ben-Amozeg proposed was that Judaism could mend the fractures of modernity by providing a framework for coexistence and rekindle the role of metaphysics and transcendence, which a narrow understanding of the Enlightenment had forfeited. And in order to do so, Ben-Amozeg also marshaled other sources than religion itself. He turned to poetry and was able to offer a new take on the poetics of coexistence. So poetry occupies a distinct place in the writing of Ben-Amozeg, notably through the presence of Dante. The focus of poetics is not on the meaning of a text, but rather its understanding of how a text's different elements come together and produce certain effects in the reader. So this paper will look at the meaning of poetry and at the poetics of Ben-Amozeg's work, its impact on the audience he was targeting that was not specifically a Jewish audience. In a way, poetics and politics are interwoven. The uses of poetry and its effects is part of the tools that Ben-Amozeg offered in his quest for religious coexistence. So the importance of poetry in Ben-Amozeg's work even predates his first written works. During the tumultuous years of the Austrian occupation of Italy, and as a young preacher in the Italy of the Risorgimento, Ben-Amozeg did not shy away from seemingly putting on an equal footing with Moses as princes of human indulgence, Dante, before whom people should bow down. Here I'll quote the speech he gave in front of the synagogue of Livorno. After mentioning the names of Dante and Moses, he exhorted his fellow Italian Jews to be worthy of this double legacy. Quote, "And what greater glory than these two great names could you yearn for? In you Israelites, you epitomize all of antiquity in its wholeness, its greatness. You epitomize in you Italian. You represent modern civilization spread to the four corners of the world. Who among you, in front of those human and divine glories called Moses and Dante, don't incline your head reverently? Of this double glory, Israelite Italians, show yourself worthy." So why would Ben-Amozeg do this? In his aesthetics, Hegel claimed that the Divine Comedy was, quote, the artistic epic proper to the Christian Catholic Middle Ages, as it reconciled the pagan and the Christian worlds. And similarly, around the time of Ben-Amozeg, Lamartine, the French poet, said that the epoch reflects itself in Dante, finds its own image, and betrays its nature. So arguably, Dante and his epic was a proper epic for both the Risorgimento and the Italian emancipation narrative. Indeed, at the time of the Risorgimento, such a mention of Dante conveyed resistance to the Austrian rule, Dante's exile from Florence and his being forced to learn, quote, how salty is the taste of another man's bread and how hard is the way of going down and up another man's stairs. So the salty bread of exile is something that Dante was very aware of. Thus, Dante was an exile, and he came to represent resistance in the face of oppression, a parallel with the fate of those who oppose repression under foreign Austrian occupation. By claiming Dante, Italian Jews and thus Ben-Amozeg could reclaim an Italian identity. Asher Salah, whom I'd like to salute here, whom I can't see but I'm saluting nonetheless, rightly argued that the reception of the Divine Comedy among Italian Jews signals two distinct moments of Italian Jewish history. Before the 18th century, it was used as a marker for differentiation from the majority culture, and thereafter as an identification with this culture. But what Ben-Amozeg promoted was not just a coexistence between Jews and non-Jews in a specific nation. He had a broader agenda, and Dante was useful for this agenda. What Ben-Amozeg sought to highlight in his understanding of Italian culture is how its universal underpinnings and principles accorded with Jewish identity. Dante's example underlines how universalism and particularism are not mutually exclusive, something that will be a thread across his work. The more Jewish, the more Italian, and this is part of the poetics of coexistence. Ben-Amozeg also held Dante's work to be the most powerful illustration of a specific ethos, an inspiration for patriots, but also the permanence of common ground, mythical and mystical, with other religions. And this is a remarkable passage of Israel and humanity when he delves into Dante's Paradise, the third and final part of the Divine Comedy. So beyond its circle motives reminiscent of Kabbalistic overtones and Kabbalistic circles, the Divine Comedy captured Ben-Amozeg's religious reading of the world, namely its final unity in Paradiso. So that's Canto 10, verse line 130 and onwards. Quote, like a clock which calls us at the hour when the bride of God rises to sing her matins to her bridegroom, that he may love her. So the matins are the Catholic morning prayers, and Ben-Amozeg proceeded to explain, quote, to sing the matins means the same thing as the Hebrew when in Shachar. It unites the idea of prayer and of mourning. It is one among the host of evidence that this has been the time most suitable for prayer and study, and this has been true from the origins of the most used language, so Hebrew. The morning prayer thus unites the world's religions in the same religious impulse to glorify God as the first thing that one does in the morning and one should do in their lives. Dante's work becomes a place, a locus of shared values and mutual translation where aesthetics meets ethics and where coexistence can be translated from one culture to the other. Non-Jews will thus be able to understand Jewish attitudes because they're akin to Dante's imagery, and Jews will recognize in indigenous practices a reflection of their Jewish universe of thought. And that was so meaningful that Ben-Amozeg went as far as to make the Commedia, the Divine Comedy, part of the curriculum of the Rabbinical College of Livorno. In his recollection of Ben-Amozeg, Yosef Colombo remembers, quote, "It is clear that Elia Ben-Amozeg studied with the greatest attention the divine poem, and for a certain time he made it a topic of beautiful lectures in our college." In his controversy with Liliadto, Tameshat, Ben-Amozeg sought to dismiss the criticism leveled at Kabbalah and claimed that it is the Kabbalists' inability to adopt the language of their enemies in order to defend themselves, which made them vulnerable to ill-founded attacks. And this notion that one should know the language of the other is also a recurring feature in his work. Here, it is not the language of the enemy that one has to learn by learning Dante, but the language of the other, and to make the other understand oneself better. And you find various examples in almost all of his eulogies of sermons of per dirlo come Dante or come l'Alighieri, so to use Dante's words. And so he has recourse to such phrases as if trying to attune his audiences here to the poet's style. And he also made use of the dialogue between Dante, the historical dialogue between Dante and Jewish sources, which was mostly framed as a relationship between the Florentine poet and Emmanuel of Rome, whose Machberet, or Heaven and Hell, comprise a description of the afterworld, which is reminiscent of Inferno, of Dante's Inferno. So poetry is a locus of mutual translation, and that shows the dialogue and the mutual enrichment of both writers and more broadly of both audience and believers. And that was also an aspect of this mutual translation that was part of the ethos of his time, something that was pursued by the first Orientalists, De Benedetti, in various works, and especially around the time of Ben-Amozeg, clearly in his work called L'Antico Testamento e la letteratura italiana, so the Old Testament and Italian literature that was published in Pisa in 1885. That notion of trying to convey similar ideals across faith, we also find a comparable model of in the work of the Orthodox rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in Germany, who used it with another towering literary figure for his fellow citizens and co-religionists with Schiller. So he made a vested effort to show the connections between Schiller and Judaism. And what emerges from those strategies, maybe, is that both Schiller and Dante are translators of national and of universal values that are a reflection of Jewish ethics, and whose Jewish origin or nature or proximities can be explained to non-Jews. So those poetics are actually a way to foster greater coexistence. And in Ben-Amozeg's work, this is even further because he compares many times poets and translators as conduits of religious values. So I'll now go to lesser-known texts, which is the lectures organized by Ben-Amozeg in 1893, as part of his series at the Pies Qualis Analyticae, where he captured this sentiment. So what those lectures were I mean, it was a range of lectures, but in a number of them, the rabbi offered a guided tour of the old cemetery of Livorno. So that guided tour was intended not only as a tribute to the intellectual heroes of the past, but also as a bridge with the future. And it was, the visits to the cemetery were buried figures that mattered a lot to him, and Ben-Amozeg found his own reflection in a way in those figures. One of them was obviously the famous rabbi L'Chida, but Ben-Amozeg's final words in those conferences were for Salomone Fiorentino, who was born in 1743 and died in 1815, who was a noted poet and a one-time resident of Livorno, to whom Ben-Amozeg paid homage. So in addition to his poetry, Fiorentino also translated the daily prayers in Italian from the Spanish and Portuguese liturgy, published by Molko in Livorno in 1825, as well in Vienna in 2022. So this idea of translation of religious poetry and liturgy was very much something that Ben-Amozeg wanted to pay tribute to. Because in his mind, poets are in fact, and act in fact as translators. They convey and elevate values through poetry in a dual and reciprocal movement from the world to the Jews and from the Jews to the world. And Ben-Amozeg emphasized such interactions as something which was similar to the power and potential of Kabbalah. Judaism is enriched by the other, by what is not specifically religious, which he then elevates. So I'm sure that many of you will talk about it in the tomorrow. This is the notion of Beruch, which he posits as a possibility for meaningful encounters with aspects of the world that are not sacred or not Jewish. And there is another fundamental aspect to poetics in Ben-Amozeg. He was absolutely bent on demonstrating how poetry can convey philosophical and theological ideas, and thus he stood against the ethos of his time that was mostly expressed by Ernest Renan. So Ben-Amozeg's reappropriation of poetry was obviously made him an advocate of Judaism, but more specifically, it helped him redefine the contribution of Oriental Judaism to civilization. So Renan's theory of Semitic religions, as we know, unfortunately, blurred the distinction between race and religion. In one of the conferences called Le Judaïsme comme race et comme religion, Judaism as race and religion, Renan described the inventors of monotheism under the umbrella term Semites and called them an incomplete race, unable to grasp the true meaning of civilization. Renan argued that Semites were characterized by inertia and a childlike nature. They were entrenched in their dogmas, plagued by minds only wired for intuition and thus predisposed to poetry rather than philosophy. So not only were the Semites, and thus the Jews, not fit for philosophy, but religion and politics were mutually exclusive for Renan because in ancient times their leaders had proven unfit to maintain the state. So what Ben-Amozeg did in order to disprove Renan was not to debunk his theory altogether, but he also enlisted other thinkers in order to do so. This is why he turned to the Italian theologian and philosopher Gioberti and really pitted Gioberti against Renan. So Gioberti used the word Japhetites, a word that is now obsolete, but describes the descendants of Japhet. And the term at the time was synonymous with Indo-European people. he used that in the same sentence to put them against the Semites, who he claimed were the true representative of the Orthodox Orient, l'Oriente ortodosso. So Gioberti said, and that accords with Ben-Amozeg worldview, that the true Orthodox were actually the Semites, not any kind of Indo-European tribe. So for the Semites, Gioberti said, beauty is a mirror of truth, imagination of the intellect, and poetry of science. So, and the others, the Japhetites, were in fact the unorthodox Orient, the pagan one. So through our reflection on the true nature of the Orient and of poetry, Ben-Amozeg strove to change the dominant narrative about Jews being unable to achieve a sense of intellectual pursuit that would enable them to participate fully in society. He was able to go against Renan and also make a case for political participation. If Semites are limited to poetry and are inert and childlike, their contribution to society would be minimal, which is the opposite of what Ben-Amozeg advocated. And indeed, if one follows Aristotle's proposition in his chapter 9 of his Poetics, quote, poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history, but in fact because in fact poetry speaks more of universals. Similarly, and much closer to us, Daniel Boyarin wrote in Intertextuality in the reading of the Midrash that poetry stands for that which is not social, but aims to transcend the present time and social context. Poetry ignores the particulars of history, but cares about its true meaning. And this captures the poetics and politics of Ben-Amozeg. He used narratives that are rooted in history, seemingly, but are ahistorical. And this is what I call his fictionalism in my book, as the operative concept. That's what he used for Adam, that's what he used for a number of biblical figures and Kabbalistic concepts. It contends that, quote, the simplest fictionalist approach to a discourse takes certain claims in that discourse to be literally false, but nevertheless worth uttering in certain contexts, since the pretense that such claims are true is worthwhile for various theoretical purposes. So the notion that this fiction is actually able to get to truth and to fulfill a certain purpose. This proposition highlights the notion of any purpose which justifies the detour through which Ben-Amozeg suggested a deeper truth could be accessed. The utilitarian nature, in a way, of these fictions befits the prospective nature of Ben-Amozeg's writing, which is emphasizing human unity in its capacity for self-understanding through narrative and myth. And this is best exemplified through religion. So religion is also a lens for self-understanding, which is even more important in modernity. And poetry actually serves the same purpose. That's through that's channeled through which a deeper truth can be accessed. Finally, and this is going to be my last point, poetry was also very much linked to prophecy in Ben-Amozeg's work. And Ben-Amozeg needed to reclaim both. He tried to show how prophets were actually poets because they could act upon this divinely inspired vision and make a new world appear through their words and actions. And the stakes for reclaiming prophecy in Judaism at the time were extremely high. So first of all, because it was another rebuttal of Renan, who characterized the Hebrew prophets as authoritarian figures, which was very far from the political vision that Ben-Amozeg had for ancient Israel. And second, because Ben-Amozeg, like a number of Jewish scholars, pushed against Christian efforts to deny Judaism the prophetic tradition. That is because the 19th century gave renewed attention to prophecy, but especially in the Catholic world, with the neo-Catholic movement that reclaimed prophecy in order to promote a more liberal agenda in the face of post-1830s and especially 1848 conservative reaction. So this is true, for instance, for writers such as Lamennais in France, which Ben-Amozeg read and knew very well. And this current of thought, the Christian current of thought, emphasized the role of the individual as a leader in the service of his ideals, and interwoven with the remnant of the romantic cult for individuality in the service of the masses, now with a socialist and with brotherly humanistic overtones. But Ben-Amozeg, just like Luzzato's commentary on the book of Isaiah, aimed to show that those brotherly humanistic contents were very much part of Judaism, and that there was a universalistic passion of the prophet. So prophecy might have fallen silent, but its legacy endured, and its motives were revived in poetry, thus pointing to the foundation shared by Judaism and other faiths. So by showing the commonalities of values, aspirations, and perspectives, scholars could educate their co-religionists to speak a common idiom and demonstrate their credentials to the non-Jewish world. They aimed to show that Judaism was not only a religion of reason, as the Wissenschaft des Judentums was trying to assert in a very monolithic way, but also a religion of inspiration, a religion with a particular affinity with both poetry and prophecy. And in doing so, they also sought to demonstrate the worthiness of Judaism and the ways in which it could be articulated with or show the way to other faiths in order to promote a world in which metaphysics would not be sent packing, as Ben-Amozeg said. So, to conclude, in his book, Dante, Poet of the Secular World, the literary critic Erich Auerbach held that the, quote, the perception of history and immanent reality arrived at in the comedy through an eschatological vision flowed back into real history. This is the same conception of politics that Ben-Amozeg shared, an eschatological vision that flows back into history. It posits that because the source of all things is one and divine, that opposites should be emphasized and elevated, and no one is better equipped for this task than Judaism and also especially Kabbalah. So Ben-Amozeg used poetry and poetics in order to stress the unity of religions, but it is also operative for the articulation of secular and religious knowledge. This, in Ben-Amozeg's view, distinguished Kabbalah from other theological systems. Quote, anti-Kabbalistic monotheism exaggerates the unitary principle by negating the gradation between God and the world, or, to be more accurate, by substituting a wrong vision of unity. But poetry is thus that path towards a unity. Poetry and thus beauty, and in a way, Ben-Amozeg based himself on Judah Leon Abravanel's Dialogue of Love, in which he argued that Plato had studied among Israelites in Egypt, and that a closer look at Greek myth, such as the androgyne in the Symposium, would manifest their real provenance, the Garden of Eden. So not only is Judaism reconciled with philosophy, but it means that it is even more penetrating, that it actually deciphers the underlying philosophy of ancient myth. So he's making this poetics appear, really interwoven with philosophy. And by doing so, Ben-Amozeg forges politics of coexistence, which is a participation in society that is both timeless and time-bound. And this, I think, explains why every age, timeless and time-bound, would be well inspired to return to the thought of the Livorno's rabbi. Thank you very much.